The case of the Queen against Elgar is in its third and final day. After having pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to obtain money by deception, he now faces further charges in connection with a fire at his shop premises. Yesterday, under cross-examination by the prosecution, he broke down and admitted that he had set fire to the shop. He was unable to continue giving evidence, and the court adjourned early.
My lord, my client is now sufficiently recovered to resume his testimony.
I'm glad to hear it. And the defendant's mother?
Oh, I'm happy to say she is, after all, going to be well enough to appear as a witness.
Then I take it that there is no question of a change of plea.
No, my lord.
Very well. The defendant may return to the witness box. Mr. Parsons, have you concluded your cross-examination?
No, my lord.
I would remind you, Mr. Elgar, that you are still on oath. And I would remind the jury that everything the defendant said in the witness box yesterday was also on oath. Now it is up to you to attach what importance you think right to certain utterances which were made, possibly hysterically, impulsively, or under stress. Parsons?
Thank you, my lord. Now, Mr. Elgar, just before we adjourned yesterday, you admitted that you had set fire to your premises. Do I understand you now wish to retract that admission?
Yes.
Very well. Well, I'd now like to ask you some questions concerning the paraffin can that was found in your shop premises. You may recall the testimony of Fire Officer Pettit of the Foodstuff Fire Brigade, who said he found a 5-gallon drum in the back room, which was empty, though it had clearly contained paraffin because of the smell from it. Now, you put that there, did you not?
Yes, I've already said that.
Yes, I know. If you'll just bear with me for one moment. Was the can full or empty when you put it there?
It was full.
Now, how did you acquire it?
Right. Bought it from the ironmonger's.
Yes. Am I right in saying you bought it from Squire's hardware store, Denman Street, Fulchester?
Yes.
Now, can you recall when you bought it?
Sometime in September.
Yes, to be exact, the 18th of September last. Would that be right?
I suppose so.
You suppose? Well, that's the date I have in a copy of the receipt here from Squire's hardware store. Would you dispute this?
No.
No. So on September the 18th, 4 days before the fire at your shop, you placed a large can of paraffin in the back room. Now, you've explained to the court that the reason for this was that in the winter you were going to heat that back room with a paraffin heater. You had not yet decided which model to buy.
That's right.
So, will you please tell the court, why did you buy all this paraffin to fill a heater you hadn't yet bought?
I just saw it in the ironmonger's and I bought it.
Well, I mean, would you buy petrol if you didn't have your van?
That's an absurd analogy.
Well, I'm sorry you find it absurd. I'll tell you what I find absurd, Mr. Elgar, what I find utterly preposterous, and that's a series of limp, implausible explanations you've given this court. I'll ask you one more question about the can, and perhaps this time you can summon up an answer that has a ring of truth about it. Station Officer Pettit said that when he found the can after the fire, the tap at the bottom was in a diagonal position. That is to say, it was neither fully closed nor fully open. Now, how do you account for that?
Well, I can't.
You can't. Did you put the tap in that position when you left the can there?
No.
Well, how do you think it got like that?
The only thing I can think of is that in moving furniture around in that room, somehow something knocked against it and budged it a little.
Somehow something knocked against it and budged it a little. Well, that answer is just about as convincing as most of your other answers. Let me ask you something that requires a simple yes or no. Would you say that if someone wanted to start a fire somewhere, a very good way to do it would be to leave a large can of paraffin dripping slowly so that everything in the vicinity became soaked in paraffin?
Well, it'd be just as easy to pour all the paraffin straight out.
Yes, either way, very effective.
I imagine so.
You imagine?
I have no experience of starting fires.
Well, I now come to the evidence given by your friend and former partner, Gerald Stroud. You heard him testify that he visited you at the shop on September 19th last, 3 days before the fire, and found you upset and angry about a letter you had received from the landlords about the higher rent. Now, was Mr. Stroud correct in describing you as upset and angry?
Yes.
And am I right in saying that as a result of that letter, you made 2 phone calls to the landlords, Messrs. Chester and Hussey?
Yes.
And in fact, in the second phone call, you became quite abusive, did you not?
Not really abusive, no.
No? Mr. Stroud has testified that you told him you were going to refuse to sign the new lease, and that you said the shop can go up in flames for all I care. But you've denied this. You claim you said the shop can go to blazes for all I care.
That's right.
Go to blazes. Now, that's a rather old-fashioned phrase, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought it was still in common usage.
I simply meant the shop could go to hell.
Yes, or something much more inflammatory. But you are asking the court to believe that in a moment of anger, you would say, go to blazes. What you said was, the shop can go up in flames for all I care, and that is precisely what you meant. Because, in a fit of pique and anger with your landlords, you decided to set fire to the premises. You then went out and bought a 5-gallon can of paraffin. You then decided to cheat your insurance company by buying the most expensive antiques you could afford, concealing them in your van, and then adding them to the claim, along with everything else that had been destroyed or damaged in the fire. No further questions.
And you wish to re-examine, Mr. Lotterby?
Yes, briefly, my lord. Mr. Elgar, whereabouts is this ironmonger's, Squire's, where you bought the paraffin?
In Delamain Street.
Is that far from your shop?
No, it's just round the corner.
Mm-hmm. Do they know you in there? I mean, do they recognise you know where your shop was?
Oh, yes.
Well, why didn't you go further afield to get your paraffin, to somewhere where you weren't known?
Why should I?
Exactly. Why should you? Thank you, Mr. Elgar.
Mr. Elgar, I wish to ask you a question.
Yes, my lord.
Which I think your counsel has neglected to do.
My lord?
You have testified that you kept a dozen or so blankets in the back room used for packing.
Yes.
Now, were those blankets in the same part of the room as the can of paraffin?
No, they were on the opposite side.
Members of the jury, you will remember that the fire officer, Mr. Pettit, testified that if the fire had started amongst the blankets, as opposed to amongst the wooden furniture, that it might have smouldered for several hours so long as the blankets were not close to the paraffin.
I'm deeply indebted to your lordship. Something I'd quite overlooked.
Yes, I rather thought it was, Mr. Lotterby. You may return to the dock.
I call Marion Elgar.
Marion Elgar, please.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Take the Bible in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Your name is Marion Elgar, and you live at Briar Cottage, Haley Hill, Fulchester?
Yes.
And you are the mother of the defendant, Peter John?
Yes.
Mrs. Elgar, I understand that you've been brought here by ambulance from Fulchester Royal Infirmary and that it is waiting to take you back.
Yes.
You may be seated if you wish.
I'd rather stand.
I promise that we will keep you here for as short a time as possible.
Thank you.
Mrs. Elgar, how long have you lived at your present address?
Many years. My husband, my late husband, bought the cottage just after the war. It must be, 27 years.
And am I right in saying that it is only in the last 2 years that your son, the defendant, has shared the cottage with you?
Yes. He came to join me when my health began to deteriorate.
Now, Mrs. Elgar, will you please tell the court what you remember of the evening of September the 22nd last?
Was that the night of the fire?
Yes, it was.
Well, Peter came home from the shop about the usual time.
Now, what time was that?
Between 6 and past. We had a drink, some sherry.
You always have a drink?
No, only on Friday and Saturdays, and that was a Saturday. It's a habit that dates from my husband's time. He would only have a drink on Friday and Saturday evenings. I think Peter does the same. It's strange how habits pass on to...
Mrs. Elgar, you were saying you had a sherry?
Yes. And then Peter went into the kitchen to make the dinner.
That's customary, is it?
Yes, he's an excellent cook and he enjoys it, which I don't. Afterwards, we watched television.
Now, what time would that be when you'd finished the meal and were sitting down watching the television?
Well, I can't be sure. About 8:15, I should think. Yes, it must have been, because it was about an hour later that we got the phone calls.
Ah, yes. Now, would you please tell the court about those telephone calls?
Well, there were two of them. The first was from the police telling Peter the shop was on fire, and the second was from one of the tenants in the flats above the shop phoning from a public coal box to say the same.
And what happened then?
Well, Peter dashed out and drove off. I heard one strike and he hadn't come in. In the morning, I found him sitting in the kitchen with his face and hands still black from the fire.
Are you quite certain that from the time your son came home from the shop at about 6:30 until the time the telephone rang at 9:20, he was at home in the cottage with you and never left?
Quite certain. Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Elgar.
Now, Mrs. Elgar, still on that same fateful evening, when your son went into the kitchen to prepare the meal, where were you?
In the sitting room.
Were you already watching television?
No, I don't think I watched television that evening before supper.
But you can't be sure.
Well, it's many months ago.
Yes, quite so, quite so. Now, how long would you say your son was in the kitchen preparing supper?
I really don't know. About half an hour or so.
Yes. Is there a back door in the kitchen?
Yes, it leads to the...
Yes, it leads to the garage at the side of the house, does it not?
Yes.
Now, suppose that you perhaps had been watching television and your son had gone out of that back door. Would you have heard him?
Yes.
You would have heard him go out?
I should have heard the door open and I'd have heard it close.
You're quite sure? Your hearing is good?
There's nothing wrong with my hearing.
But just suppose, Mrs. Elgar, suppose you had been watching television and your son had gone out of the back door, opening and closing it quietly.
What is it you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that if the meal had been something that more or less cooked itself, if it could be left over a low light, your son, in that half hour or so, could have driven into Fulchester, to the shop, and been back in time to put the meal on the table.
No, he couldn't. I'd have heard him. I'd have heard him go and I'd heard him come back. You've no right to make such a wicked insinuation. No right at all. He's suffered enough already. I won't stay here and listen to your wicked insinuations.
Mrs. Elgar.
You can go to blazes for all I care.
Mrs. Elgar, how old are you? How old are you, Mrs. Elgar?
Please answer the question, Mrs.
Oh,
Elgar.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I didn't hear what was asked.
Thank you, Mrs. Elgar. No further questions, my lord.
But I
That's
could...
all right, Mrs. Elgar. You may leave now unless Mr. Lotterby has some more questions for you. Thank you for coming from the hospital.
I call Louise Anstruther.
Louise Anstruther, please.
You really are playing for sympathy, aren't you?
My lord, with your permission, Mrs. Anstruther will give her testimony from the wheelchair.
Very well, she may do so.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Your name is Louise Anstruther?
Yes.
And you live with your husband at flat 4, 17A, Manning Street, Fulchester?
Yes.
Now, that is the flat above the antique shop, Elgar and Stroud, is it not?
That's right, except the shop's there no more. Sign's been taken down.
The premises are still closed, are they?
Yes, Your Honour. Or should I say, my lord?
As long as the tone is respectful, Mrs. Anstruther, I never mind what the witness calls me.
Mrs. Anstruther, how well do you know the defendant?
Oh, fairly well. Saw quite a bit of him the 2 years since we moved in the flat.
Where was this? Where did you see him?
At the shop. I used to pop in there quite often.
You're interested in antique furniture, are you?
Oh, I'd like to be. Mr. Elgar taught me quite a few things about different periods and different woods and about what to look for to tell if something had been doctored up to look like an antique.
Did you ever buy anything from him?
Yes, 2 chairs. Oh, not proper antiques. Country pieces, Mr. Elgar called them. Windsor chairs.
When did you last call in to see Mr. Elgar?
Earlier on the day of the fire in the afternoon.
Now, did you go into the back room, or did you just stay in the front part of the shop?
No, I went into the back room. Mr. Elgar was working there.
Now, can you remember what was in that room?
Yes, I remember seeing a big can in the corner, some bits of furniture, and there was a pile of blankets he used for packing on the floor.
A pile of blankets. Now, whereabouts in the room? Near the can you've told us about?
No, away from there on the other side of the room.
Thank you, Mrs. Anstruther, that's all.
Mrs. Anstruther, from what you've been saying, I infer that prior to the fire you were not confined to a wheelchair.
Yes, Your Honour.
Are you the person who was injured on the night of the fire?
Yes.
Tell us about the fire.
Well, there was a banging at our front door, and I went to it, and it was Mr. Peters from the top floor. He said that the shop downstairs was on fire and I'd better get out.
Yes, can you remember what time this was?
Oh, about a 9:15, or perhaps 10:02. Well, I looked down the stairs and I couldn't see any fire or smoke or anything, so I nipped back in the flat to get our bits and pieces.
To get your...
Oh, I've got a few bits of jewellery, and Fred, my husband, has some silver cups
Yes.
that he won as a lad.
Yes.
He was a fast runner,
Yes.
a sprinter, the
Yes.
100 and the 220.
Yes, I gather then that your husband was not at home that evening.
No, he was at the pub, Your Honour. It being Saturday, I didn't expect
So
him
you
till
went
closing.
back to collect your valuables?
Yes, and put them in a suitcase together with my fur. Then I went to the front door, opened it, and got the shock of my life. The lights had gone out on the landing, and all I could see was smoke. Great gusts of smoke coming up the staircase like clouds, and I could smell it. I didn't dare go any further. I turned and went back as quick as I could, dropping the suitcase. By now, the flat was full of smoke. Well, I went to the window, opened it, and leaned out. It was very bright down in the street. Lots of lights all over the place. And I could see faces and the fire engines, and I could hear the siren. There was a lot of noise and people shouting. And I shouted down, "Help! Help!" And I could see faces looking up. And I yelled, "Should I jump?" And I thought I heard a man say, "Right you are." And I could see men standing below the window, sort of holding their arms out. And I put one foot up on the ledge and I pushed myself out. But I found out later that what the man was yelling was, "Stay right where you are." Oh, I was in hospital for 4 months.
And now you are paralysed from the waist down?
No, not strictly speaking. My functions, but they still function, I'm thankful to say. It's just my legs. It's just the use of my legs.
I see. Thank you. Mr. Parsons?
Thank you, my lord. Now, you know, don't you, Mrs. Anstruther, that Mr. Elgar is accused of having started the fire which resulted in you being paralysed.
Of course.
So I take it you don't blame the defendant for the injuries you incurred.
No, I don't.
Now, why not?
Why not? Because he never set fire to the shop.
Well, what makes you say that?
Well, he couldn't. Not on your life he couldn't. It's not in his nature.
Not in his nature. Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, some men are capable of doing something violent like that, and some aren't. And he couldn't. He's a very gentle man. Oh, couldn't swat a fly, I'm sure. And as for setting fire to antiques...
Yes, so you think that poor Mr. Elgar has been wrongly accused and you've come here to help him?
Yes, I do.
That's why you've come to tell the court about the blankets.
Well, it's important, isn't it?
Yes, but did you really see them?
Yes, I did.
Now, Mrs. Anstruther, when you heard that Mr. Elgar had pleaded guilty to a charge of attempting to obtain money by deception, the deception being a fraudulent insurance claim on the damage caused by the fire, were you surprised?
Oh, yes, absolutely flabbergasted. We all were.
Why was that? Was it because you didn't think it was in his nature to do such a thing?
Yes, and it seemed...
Thank you, Mrs. Anstruther. No further questions, my lord.
No, my lord.
Thank you, Mrs. Anstruther. You may leave the Whitney. That is to say, you are free to leave the court. You may either go, or if you wish to stay for the rest of the proceedings, we'll find a place for your wheelchair over there.
I'd like to stay, please.
Very well.
That concludes the case for the defence, my lord.
Members of the jury, you have listened carefully to all the evidence, and you have been addressed by both counsel. Now, there are two charges against the defendant, and they are, one, that on the 22nd of September 1973, without lawful excuse, he damaged by fire a shop at 17 Manning Street, Fulchester, belonging to Chester and Hussey, intending to damage such property. And two, that on the 22nd of September 1973, without lawful excuse, he damaged premises at 17 Manning Street, Fulchester, being reckless as to whether the lives of the tenants at 17A Manning Street, Fulchester, would be thereby endangered. Now, the key question you have to consider is how was that fire started? Now, you've read the report of the fire prevention officer, which stated that no accidental cause could be found for the fire, and therefore it must be considered to be of doubtful origin. Now, was that fire started quickly, with the aid of paraffin, late in the evening, when only the defendant had access to the premises, or had it been smouldering there for several hours? Now, you will know that the defendant has already pleaded guilty to another offence, and as counsel has pointed out, that does not necessarily presuppose that he is guilty of the offences with which he is now charged. As always, in a court of law, there must be a presumption of innocence. Each charge must be considered on its own merits, and the accused person must be considered innocent until he is proved guilty. However, you may think that by admitting that he is guilty of that other offence, he has provided himself with a motive for committing the offences with which he is now charged. And you might also think that had it not been for the resourceful inquiries made by the insurance company investigator, Miss Greene, the defendant might not have been charged with either offence. It will not have escaped your notice, members of the jury, that there is no direct evidence against the accused. That is to say, nobody saw him strike a match in order to start the fire. What evidence there is against him is circumstantial evidence. Now, a piece of circumstantial evidence does not of itself prove a person guilty, but it does create a circumstance, or circumstances, which makes it possible for that person to be guilty, or alternatively makes it less likely that any other person is guilty. Where the weight of circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, it is sufficient to convict, but only if the prosecution has proved to you, beyond all reasonable doubt, members of the jury, that the accused is guilty. Will you now please retire to consider your verdict?
All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached verdicts on which you're all agreed?
Yes.
On the first count, do you find the accused, Peter Elgar, guilty or not guilty of damaging by fire the premises of a shop at 17 Manning Street, Fulchester?
Not guilty.
On the second count, of damaging the said premises, being reckless as to whether the lives of the tenants at 17A Manning Street, Fulchester would be thereby endangered, do you find the accused, Peter Elgar, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
You are discharged and are free to leave the court.
All stand.
Next week, a chance for you to join another jury in assessing the facts when our cameras return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.